It's probably impossible for me to be entirely objective about Final Fantasy XIV. This is the game I play between all the other games I play, a gaming cadence I repeat on a day-to-day basis. It's also part of one of my favourite video game franchises, designed to appeal to the vast majority of my very specific, personal gaming preferences. As a brief introduction for those who aren't aware, Final Fantasy XIV is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that does not lock the player character to a single job or class. You can level these independently on a single character and swap between them at will. The world areas are instanced rather than open. The game also has the de facto best dungeon finder in gaming at the moment, and has systems set up to encourage max level players to play low level content by giving them suitable rewards for doing so. This helps keep all the content in the game valuable, regardless of whether you have 10,000 hours or 10 in the game. Make no mistake, this game is good. Final Fantasy XIV is no longer the train wreck of an MMO it was when I first played in 2010, nor is it the successful reclamation project that started with A Realm Reborn and took us through Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers. Each of those expansions added something to the game. Each of them slowly helped swell the player base and community, and when Shadowbringers launched a few years ago, I believe this game had reached its apex. Believe me when I tell you I am delighted that I was wrong. However, a lot of what Shadowbringers did well, Endwalker does well also. This starts with a mature story which doesn't shy away from the cold realities of war or death. It understands that for a conflict to take place, you can't just have one good entity and one bad entity. You need to have two forces that equally believe they are in the right, or have an equally fervent desire for something. If not, a climactic clash cannot occur. Of course, this is still ultimately a Final Fantasy game, so the unbridled sense of hope eternal from our protagonist's closest allies does inevitably anchor a lot of the plot, but this story doesn't treat you with kid gloves. Ultimately, the bad guys are bad to an almost offensive degree, and the good guys are at times sickeningly good. Yet everywhere you look, there's the potential to view our heroes as meddlesome idealists, and view the bad guys as emotionally damaged victims. All of these elements in the story existed prior to Endwalker, and as expected, you can't just boot up the game with a level 1 character and see the denouement of this tale. Endwalker content is only accessible to players who have at least one combat job role at level 80, have finished the final installment of the Shadowbringers main story quest, and have an Endwalker key registered on their account. In contrast, while you might be able to access the content, to get the most out of the story, you'll need to have some sort of emotional investment in the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, and the narrative that has come before. In a more traditional RPG setting, these would be your party members, and some elements of the gameplay here, they function like that, but they mostly exist to drive and anchor the narrative. Each dungeon you unlock, each trial encounter, and most of the endgame content is tied behind story progression, and while you can skip dialogue and cutscenes should you wish, you are ultimately depriving yourself of a great deal of the game if you do. On the surface, Endwalker's new additions are actually fairly standard. New enemies, new dungeons, new locales to explore, new jobs, and new story content. Alongside this, there are obviously new items, quests, and abilities. Endwalker also brings with it an increased level cap from 80 to 90, and a general restructure of some of the game's mechanics. But the changes here are more slight than sweeping in terms of how each class plays. This is not an attempt to rip up the playbook that you spent years mastering. Endwalker also brought with it one new problem: queues. I've been playing this game on and off for about 11 years on 2 different European worlds, and have never had to wait in a queue of more than 100 people. For Endwalker, these queues really got out of hand. I understand the difficulty of predicting the popularity of an online game and acquiring hardware for servers in 2021. I was much more willing to tolerate this, not only due to the goodwill the game's built up over the years, but because the producer informed us that ahead of time that they expected this to happen, clearly laid out the issue and an action plan to take care of it. Players have been given additional game time as a form of compensation, and while I'd rather be playing the game after work, I do understand that when the thing you like is as popular as this is, lots of other people are going to want a piece of it. When you make it past the queue and start playing, the game feels different in some regards, and it's not always easy to pinpoint why. I do believe a lot of it is to do with the change in the on-screen values. Certainly at a glance, the numbers you're accustomed to seeing are now much lower. Your overall effectiveness is the same, but your tank's health is no longer 130,000, but rather closer to 50, a noticeable difference. The same applies to damage numbers and a lot of the stats. When put into practice, this doesn't really affect the content currently in the game, although you might have to relearn your expectations for what ranges your damage should be in. It's this change that gives off the impression that the new instances and encounters are harder than those previously included, but this seems to be more to do with players not being able to quickly ascend to the maximum gear score due to the aforementioned server congestion. In a practical sense, tanks do appear to take a bit more damage, and some of the mega pulls that you used to see during roulettes have been reined in a little. but mostly this is an effect of numbers on the back end losing a dress size or two, and the margins between actual values being slightly slimmer. It does work wonders in practice, as it helps the new encounters feel more active and involved than ever before. If you have a feel for a job or a role, this hasn't been changed. At the end of the day, this still feels and plays like Final Fantasy XIV. The main mechanical change has actually come to one of the gathering classes, fishing, where the way you gather fish with your spear has been revamped entirely. This is now much more involved and easier to understand. Before, you'd be stabbing bubbles as they flashed, and now you can see the shadow of each fish clearly and time your stabs a bit better. Yes, it's a small change, but you can absolutely tell how good a game is by the quality of its fishing minigame. Final Fantasy's minigame now reflects the quality of the rest of the game. The gathering of high quality materials has also been replaced with a simple quantity increase, which works in exactly the same way, except your percentage chance now gives you an extra item rather than a slightly better version of an item. Once the initial surge of market inflation goes down, I'm expecting per item prices to be slightly lower, as it's now easier to gather in bulk. As you might expect, players who begin their Endwalker adventure are sent to several different locations and meet a variety of different characters, doing the usual good guy thing of helping out the locals and gaining new allies to fight off the larger threat to the world. While I do intend to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, I will say that Endwalker is rooted in the conclusion of the story that was salvaged with A Realm Reborn, featuring guest appearances by antagonists from Stormblood and Shadowbringers. This is very much the end of this chapter for the game, so there are elements of Endwalker's narrative that feel like a trip down memory lane. There are also several moments where characters perform actions and say things that are nods to the past. The more you know and have played this game previously, the more Endwalker will resonate with you. And if you're a fan of a particular Final Fantasy game starring a man named Cecil, this expansion has some brilliant moments you're going to love. A large portion of this is what you'd expect from an MMO expansion, but this feels different than the same sort of thing I've experienced it previously in World of Warcraft, The Elder Scrolls Online, or Guild Wars 2. This is because of Final Fantasy XIV's strong narrative focus. This combination of events feels heavier and more meaningful than it otherwise would. The headliner here is the conclusion of the story. More than one person I play with has commented that they've gotten genuinely emotional as they finish the story. I had no such reaction, no strong oh my god moment or tears rolling down my face as we reached the end. I did appreciate that on a structure basis, the game's final act brought together a cast of characters that were relevant, returned old friends to the fold, and used the game's dungeons to pay homage to the characters we've lost. This game has been on such a journey, and the final installment of this chapter is one massive love letter to a community that gave the game a chance after royally dropping the ball on day one. In terms of specifics, this narrative does an excellent job of developing characters like Estinian, who has been a figure on the periphery of the science for a long time, and giving Oriangia a much needed dose of levity for parts. In this expansion, it feels like both have been promoted from recurring characters to series regulars, even if the Levelia twins once more take top billing. I was also quite impressed how this story did a lot of things I couldn't predict. You'd think after a decade I'd have most of this figured out, but there was one moment early on where I knew I had no idea. You meet a young woman who hasn't been affected by the tempering, which is essentially a brainwashing wave of magic. She reluctantly accepts your aid, and based upon what happened in the game previously, you assume she'd help you settle into the area and introduce you to all her friends so you can form a resistance and take down the real bad guys. Damn, was I wrong. Other moments of surreal disbelief are mixed in with the sort of predictable but still enjoyable jokes between the main characters. These feel like small snippets of anime filler episode, before the attention turns back to saving the universe. Outside of what I consider the main draw, the story, Endwalker also brings with it new jobs, such as the Reaper and Sage. The Reaper is a melee DPS job that wields a scythe, and while the Sage is a healer job which uses laser beams fired from floating guns. Yes, healing in Final Fantasy now involves firearms. Each one feels fresh and unique, even if they do fill roles that already existed. In particular, these are here to provide choice on how you want to experience the game as an individual player, not to widen the breadth and scope of the roles available. Where Endwalker does drop the ball a little bit is in terms of its pacing, which is inconsistent, particularly towards the end. There are long moments of quiet respite that feel like the game is dragging its feet, and others where you're just foisted into something with little more than a line of dialogue for context. These all work within the story and don't detract from the overall value of it, but I do get the impression that some scenes might have been cut or added last minute to bring the overall length of the story up or down. The quality of some of the textures is also starting to age. Some of the armor sets feel stretched and unnecessarily pixelated. I do expect this for the older sets, as attempting to upscale even a single player's grammar dresser would be a gargantuan task for a dev team, never mind every piece of gear in the game. But some of Endwalker's sets feel like they've been made under the same restrictions. They actually look a lot better in 1080p than if you're playing in 4K, while overall the character models tend to hold up regardless of resolution. More specifically to myself, I wasn't a fan of a handful of story and primary side quests, which required you to perform short stealth sections in the game. These asked you to follow and hide from an NPC. My main objection is not the inclusion of a new mechanic, rather than that it seems to go against everything the game has taught me thus far. For instance, I'm the Warrior of Light with a chocobo that can fly and two magical twins who can heal every single injury under the sun. I can think of several ways my abilities would be better suited to catching a slow, tired civilian who is trying to get away from me. It's for this reason I'm not always on board with sections where you play as a character other than the Warrior of Light, as that's not the skill the game's been asking me to get good at for 10 years. My complaint here is the same as for the PS4 Spider-Man game. Don't take away my superpowers and ask me to hide away as a weaker character for the sake of killing your story's pacing. There are other, better ways you can vary up gameplay. One exception to this I will make comes during a level 83 quest, where you play as an Imperial soldier. The urgency and feeling of helplessness in that form, compared to your standard overpowered self, are paramount to making a key plot device develop and work. It's important that you are deprived of your powers at that moment to achieve this. Another new mechanic installed here helps you better feel attached to the characters using the follow mechanic. This is essentially where NPCs follow you around, and then you interact with someone or something. The biggest issue with these quests is that these characters are much more anchor than escort, and seem to untether from you alarmingly quickly. You can't get on a mount or fly if you wish for them to continue to follow you, and at times I'd just out of habit get on my chocobo only to discover when I arrived at the objective I couldn't progress, because I needed to run there on the ground at a speed my tag-along deemed acceptable. This would have been a cool use of multi-person mounts like the Regalia if followed NPCs could be told to ride as passengers, but instead they helplessly follow for a few seconds before routing to the spot you went out of range at. In a similar vein, with 4 expansions and an entire world reboot in, do we really need to be glued to the ground for the majority of an area's story content just because we haven't collected all the token ether currents in an area? Granted, I didn't dislike this initially, as there was a great deal of anticipation being built up before taking to the skies in Heavensward. Yet, these Endwalker areas are now far too big for you to be dumped on them at any point without the ability to fly. Just throw a pop-up on my screen that says, your abilities as the Warrior of Light allow you to attune to the currents. At this point, such a restriction feels less like a tool to build hype, and more like a brick wall to kill the game's pacing. There was enough here that there was no need to make this game longer. Instead, all this did was account for about half of my frustration with the game once I'd gotten in after the queues. I opened this review saying it was difficult for me to be objective, and if you've made it this far, you'll understand why. For me, having more Final Fantasy XIV and an excuse to play it for more than the hour or so each day to do a daily roulette was all I needed, even if I don't absolutely love everything here. But do I think this is a good place for someone who hasn't played an MMO, or this MMO, to come in? I originally wrote no, as this game feels like it was designed specifically for existing players, as the majority of the game's payoff was narrative. Heavensward and Stormblood felt much more like starting places for me, as they could sell new mechanics like flying and underwater mounts. Based simply on the sheer volume of content a brand new player would have to experience, from A Realm Reborn right through to Shadowbringers, before they could even experience Endwalker, is certainly no small feat. Skipping this with a level boost would ultimately deprive the player of the narrative developments that allow Endwalker to land as well as it does. However, there's plenty of evidence to suggest I'm incredibly wrong. Final Fantasy XIV's player base has been steadily growing since COVID-19, and really gained momentum earlier in 2021. New people are signing up to experience this adventure every day, to the point where the game had to stop letting them do so. So there must be something I'm missing. The only element of this expansion that I specifically feel feels new player friendly are how the XP changes to gathering and crafting have been handled. It's no joke that you can go from 80 to 90 for fishing, mining or botany in around 3 hours per class. Crafters take a bit longer, but you're still leveling up a lot faster than you would have done in previous expansions. For me, I can't fault Endwalker. Despite the things it does poorly, and despite the things I really love, it's the payoff for an investment I made over a decade ago, and it feels incredible for it to finally be here and to experience the end of this tale. Anyone who's thinking of returning to play this game again, I would recommend to do so in a heartbeat, but like anything that's an expansion, you do mostly need to be a fan of the original package in order for this to apply. And if that's the case, you didn't need me to tell you to come back and play this one, as this game has been consistently getting better and better since A Realm Reborn.